Introductions for the panelists so that you have an idea of who they are, and then I'm going to start with, I'm going to launch into some questions. Roger?
I'm Roger Landrum. I was a 1961 to 63 volunteer in Nigeria, then went to work at the headquarters. I've been involved in the return volunteer movement, I don't know, for 30 years now. I was an early president of RPCVW. I was a board chairman of the NPCA when it was still the National Council of Return Peace Corps Volunteers. My real career was in national service. I created an organization called Youth Service America, which laid the foundation for AmeriCorps, the National Community Service Act of 1990 and 93. It was a Ford Foundation funded outfit. I did that for about 20 years.
Okay.
I'm Jerry Lutes. I was a volunteer in Panama starting in 1969. They threw Peace Corps out of Panama. I went to the Dominican Republic and finished up in 71. And then in 75, I came to Washington and was involved with the initial activities that led to the creation of RPCVW.
My name is Debby Prigal, and I was a volunteer in Ghana from 81 to 83. I came to Washington right afterwards in 80 and joined RPCV Washington as a member right off the boat. Some of them remember what I was like then.
I do.
He can't believe that the screaming 23-year-old that he remembers is now 53 and has progressive lenses. I was elected to the board of the National Council of Returned Peace Corps Volunteers just right after I got there for 3 years. And then when I came back from graduate school, I was the treasurer of RPCV Washington for 3 years. Got us the 501c3 status if you've ever written a tax-deductible check. I've been the treasurer of Friends of Ghana since about 2003, 2004. And in my day job, I do statistical work for U.S. Citizen and Immigration Services.
Hi, I'm Lisa Martin. I served in Estonia 96 to 98 as an English teacher in a small village just outside of the capital, Tallinn. And I moved to D.C. in January of 99, and almost soon thereafter got involved with the NPCA's planning of the 40th, which turned into the 40+1. I served as the events chair of that event and was recruited onto the RPCVW board by the president then, Dave O'Neill. So I came onto the RPCVW board as president and served 2001 to 2004. And then I also, around that time, I actually did Crisis Corps and Rita Katrina Relief. And what else was Peace Corps related? I've for many years, I've been president of Friends of the Baltics. And I'm very active with the Estonian community, and we'll be going back to sing in their song festival with the Estonian choir this summer. And also, just to give a plug to Partners of the Americas, which is also a JFK-founded organization. I serve on its international board, and I'm also the DC chapter president. So, thanks.
So, for 3 of these board members, I've actually have done individual interviews with them. So, because of that experience, I want to bring out some of what we spoke about in our previous interviews. So, I wanted to start with Roger, and I would like for him to just talk a little bit about the 25th anniversary. This was a very big event that happened in sort of Peace Corps history and helped sort of kick off a number of things.
Okay, let me give just a brief background before I go into that. In 1965, the Peace Corps Agency had a conference here in Washington of returned volunteers, to which about 1,000 people came. And a lot of interesting things happened. There's some documents actually on that. It was the first gathering of RPCVs. But what I wanted to mention to you was that there was an almost unanimous decision at that meeting not to have a national organization of RPCVs, which thinking how to characterize this, threw a sort of a wet towel on the whole idea of organizing a national network of RPCs for many, many, many years. And the breakthrough came when the group, the sort of historic group in Iowa, formed what was called the National Council of RPCVs in, I don't know, something like 1979 or 80. And that's also when one of those people, or several of those people who were involved in that, had the first meetings of RPCVW. And that was that little bit of history is very important because it was a beachhead for something which had been stalled for such a long period of time. By the way, I stay in touch with people at AmeriCorps, and they came to see me at one point to say, how come Return Peace Corps volunteers have such active alumni and we can't get our alumni to do anything? And I laughed and said, well, look, it took 25 years. People have their lives to restart when they come back to the country and after they've been a volunteer, even in Vista or AmeriCorps. So don't expect it to happen overnight. I mean, people have to sort of get to mid-career before conditions are really right for doing this. So it wasn't all the fact that people voted it against it in 1965, but just partly the natural course of things. But at any rate, there were some of us here in Washington. We had a wonderful steering committee for several years. It was one of the best groups I've ever worked with in my entire career. And we were able to really develop some very, very dynamic programming, have some influence on Capitol Hill, where I had worked and some other RPCVs had worked. I could tell you all that, but I want to go to the 25th because a very interesting thing happened while I was president of RPCVW. Jerry will remember this. The 25th anniversary came around, and the steering committee of RPCVW said, would you go to Lorette Ruppy, the director of the Peace Corps, and see if we could work with them on planning a 25th anniversary event? So I did that. And I was told in no uncertain terms there would be no event in Washington. It was sort of a funny reaction from Lorette Ruppy, who's a big hero of the Peace Corps. So I said, well, what's this all about? She says, well, the Reagan at the White House is convinced that if you bring a lot of return volunteers to Washington, they will demonstrate against President Reagan. And therefore, we're not going to have an event in Washington, we're going to have them around the country. So I came back to the steering committee, reported this, and everybody said, bullshit, let's just do it ourselves. So what we did was put together a coalition. There were very few existing groups at the time, country of service groups or regional groups, and there were some other types of groups, but we put together a coalition of 4 organizations that were willing to put in $1,000 each to kick off organizing a 25th anniversary event in Washington, not knowing where it would lead. I mean, it's a big challenge to undertake on a volunteer basis, I'll put it that way. So we had this $4,000 to start with, and then something really interesting happened. The MacArthur Foundation heard that the Reagan administration did not want a return volunteer Peace Corps anniversary in Washington, and they sent us a check for $25,000 to organize the event. The key person in that was Harris Wofford, who knew a board member at the MacArthur Foundation and told him the story, and that MacArthur Foundation board member got the grant. And I will forever remember we had a mailbox in Cleveland Park where we got donations and all of our correspondence. And I went to that box one day and opened it up, and there was a check for $25,000. So I came back to the steering committee and said, wow, we got $25,000, what do we do now? So what we did is we began hiring staff and put together a planning group. And to make a long story sort of short, the whole thing gelled very, very quickly. We began sending out notices, and people began registering. And we had registration fees, and we began gathering a lot of money from that. And began planning the program. And the key person, you won't be surprised to hear this, the key person to help us do the really big things was Senator Teddy Kennedy. who obviously had a real interest in this. And in the absence of the Peace Corps running interference for us, Senator Kennedy's office arranged for us to get permission to use conference rooms on the mall, and, for example, to get Corazon Aquino, the recently hero who'd been elected president of the Philippines, to be the keynote speaker. Senator Kennedy was just an enormous help to all this, and people began registering by the thousands from all over the country. So pretty soon, I mean, we had well over $100,000 to begin planning with, and a lot of very interesting things happened. We figured out, well, how can we do this? At the time, you know, the place where the Native American Museum is on the mall was an empty space, and we figured that that's where we could do. We got permission to do that through Senator Kennedy, and we got a circus tent, which we ordered from California, which the rent of the tent and facilities was $63,000. But we did it, and we needed it, because in the end we had between 4,000 and 5,000 people come to Washington for the event. And just call time if I'm talking too long about this. But to put it sort of in very short terms, the thing just kind of exploded. We got tremendous national publicity, national television coverage, people interviewed in the Washington Post, et cetera, et cetera. And the Peace Corps, this is one of the really good things about Lorette Rupe. She was able then to convince the Reagan administration that this was going to happen whether they wanted it or not, and if they better let her get involved to make sure it was peaceful. So the Peace Corps then came on board with the event, so that we had a kind of a unity around the final arrangement of the thing. Sergeant Shriver came and gave a remarkable speech, which many people remember for his serve, serve, serve admonition to everybody. It was just a glorious event. And our steering committee for the event kind of featured the return volunteer groups that existed around the country, and the country of service groups. And in the wake of the event, those groups multiplied exponentially. It went from like 5 country of service groups to like 25, and regional groups started everywhere. The membership of the National Council began to increase. Our local membership increased to over 200 as a result of that. Well, we also set an agenda for the RPC movement and a goal of 10,000 members for the national organization. And we sort of really believe that return volunteers could have a big impact, not only on like Peace Corps budgeting, lobbying and stuff, but on foreign affairs in the countries where he had served. We were very intent on having a national impact on American foreign policy. But what happened immediately was we made a profit of some, I don't know, maybe like $75,000 or so from the conference. And I remember these, I went to meet with the board of the NP, the National Council of Returned Peace Corps Volunteers, which had a very anti-Washington bias. And the negotiation was, we will turn over the profits to you if you hire a paid staff, so it becomes a real organization, not just a volunteer group with a real program, and you move the headquarters to Washington so we can have a presence here in Washington for political and other reasons. And they saw the writing on the wall that if they didn't do it, then we would turn the money, use the money to form another national organization, because we knew what we wanted to do in terms of the RPC movement. So they agreed to do it, and we were able to use the money to hire the first NPCA staff. First director was Tim Carroll, who immediately hired like 4 or 5 people to form the headquarters here in Washington. And the membership of the National Council of Returned Peace Corps Volunteers then began growing. RPCVW was larger in members in membership at this time than the National Council was. But the National Council exploded after that, and pretty soon was up to like, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000 members.
Right. Thank you. And I also wanted to ask you to speak maybe briefly about some of the efforts that you had on the Hill. I know there were some recommendations that
Yes, there is.
RPCVW came
I
into.
brought a couple copies of, we created a document called Peace Corps 1985 Meeting the Challenge. And It had in it 5 recommendations, which were set a goal of 10,000 volunteers in service with increased representation in South America and Asia, establish Goal 3 of the Peace Corps Act as the central mission of the agency, remove appointment of Peace Corps country directors from the political patronage system, appoint a qualified returned Peace Corps volunteer as the next Peace Corps director following the tenure of Laurette Rupie, and create a special committee of returned Peace Corps volunteers to advise the director on operational improvements in the Peace Corps. I had been on the staff of Senator Alan Cranston, who was the second in command of the Senate during this period. And there was another RPCV named Matthew Casalato, who was a close top aide to the Speaker of the House, so that we had really good connections on the Hill. And we took these we circulated copies of this to every member of Congress, and we took the recommendations to Cranston and to Speaker of the House Jim Wright, and 3 of the recommendations were passed, including removing the country directors from the patronage system, which was incredibly important because at the time it was hit and miss. Some country directors were fine, but a lot of them were political hacks who were being paid off by whoever happened to be president and were terrible in their jobs overseas. So we got that, again, removed from the political patronage system. And again, Laurette Rupie was very helpful in that she could have stopped it, but she did not oppose removing it from the patronage system. She got the Reagan administration to agree to it. So it was signed into law. These 3 things were signed into law by President Reagan, including the 10,000 person goal and making the 3rd goal a central part of the agency mission. What we did at this time, we would look for leverage points of where we could get something very practical and important done, where we had key RPCVs. And in that case, we had me with access to Senator Cranston and Matthew Casalato in the Speaker's office. But we also had very strong RPCVs in law firms. Like there was a guy named Tom McGrew, I don't know if you guys remember him, who was a very high-powered RPCV lawyer in a big law firm here. Who had a lot of lobbying.
He was a partner at Arnold and Porter.
He had a lot of lobbying experience, and we put him in charge of lobbying on the Peace Corps budget. And he was tremendously effective in reversing declines in the Peace Corps budget and getting some increases. So the strategy, I mean, these things are fairly obvious now, but the strategy was to find the leverage points for getting this stuff done. And again, because the National Council of RPCVs was in Iowa, they were not of any use in any of this. I mean, it had to really be done here in Washington again. So we turned over all these activities to the NPCA once
Right.
came here to Washington.
Right.
But we were a very effective lobbying group for several years.
All right, thank you very much.
If some of you want to see what these recommendations were like, here's the thing we sent out to Congress.
All right.
It just circulated.
All right, now I'd just like to move on to Jerry and ask you to just describe some of the regular activities that RPCVW was doing during the 80s, like on a sort of more regular basis.
Can you get the mic?
Well, the activities, I think, started off pretty wimpy when we were just getting started, but they picked up stamina. I'd say in our first year it was mostly social events, happy hours. The structure of the organization at the very beginning was to be a committee of committees. And so there was one group that was supposed to be doing community service activities. There was another group that was supposed to focus on cross-cultural events. And I think we had potluck dinners where people would bring food representative of where they had served. We had another group that was focusing on issues and social activities. Social seemed to be what we could do best, drinking, was pretty much the theme of the first year. But about 2 years into our floundering around without a president, where we tried to have a rotating presidency and a recipe for a weak organization, we changed in, I think, probably 1981, to have a more normal set of officers. And Karen Kiefer put in a lot of energy, and much of her energy went into organizing issue fora or events. And I have a recollection of a meeting on infant formula with speakers who had been basically investigative reporters reporting how Nestle had induced women to use infant formula instead of breast milk throughout Latin America as a marketing ploy, and then their breasts dried up, and so they were hooked. They had to use infant formula. That was the only option. And to this day, I don't buy Nestle products because of that event. And at the end of the event, then it's kind of a extra. There was a fellow who wanted to talk to us about cancer and how he had survived testicular cancer and was going to make spread his message to the world by competing in sporting events like bike riding. That was Lance Armstrong. We had another issue forum on immigration right at the height of the battles under the Reagan administration. And by this time, we used the secret Peace Corps handshake. We were able to attract important people in Washington because of having well-connected RPCVs. I remember another one, and I can only assume it was about the fighting in Yugoslavia, in which Ambassador Richard Holbrooke and Senator Dodd were speakers. So we rather quickly ratcheted up from a bunch of us looking at each other over beer to having some very impressive events that drew people in. I would say the community service, which was supposed to be my responsibility, pretty much atrophied. We never did much in the way of community service events.
Remember we did the volunteer income tax?
We did the volunteer income tax, but that wasn't, I don't think, a result of the Community Service Committee. This was my getting referred to, when I first came to Washington, by a predecessor organization or another organization, the Independent Foundation, had a skills bank. And when I first came to Washington in 1975, I started looking for a way to volunteer. And Patrick Sakamunde, volunteer from Thailand, was basically running the chapter of the Independent Foundation here in Washington, which has since gone extinct, and suggested that I work with an organization that did that volunteer tax assistance. And then I was able to put it in the newsletter and suck in other people. But as an official committee function, I don't think that qualifies. So one of the other activities I remember from those early years, probably our first year, was we went and saw some Peace Corps recruiting movies. And I have a recollection of a movie featuring Roger sitting in a tree, having a dialogue with Nigerians on the ground, talking about the philosophy of Americans being in Nigeria or something like that. I can't remember the substance. I can just remember Roger in the tree.
The Nigerians said that we were still seeking the frontier, except now we were seeking it in Nigeria.
Of course, another thing that had its start in those early years was the annual wreath laying ceremony.
Yeah, we still do that.
Yes. And then because of our philosophy of being a committee of committees in the beginning days, and that kind of stuck with us, it was like, we'll provide a framework and you guys go off and do your own thing. A group of volunteers got very interested in U.S. policy toward Central America, and particularly the support we were giving to the repressive regimes in El Salvador and Nicaragua in the name of fighting communism. And they kind of, RPCVW provided like the incubator for them forming their own little group that wrote the book Voices of Experience in Central America, that was presenting their view as former Peace Corps volunteers from Central America on how much harm this was doing to the U.S. And I think there is one other event. Roger is a visionary and an expert delegator. One of his visions was that we should have annual trips to exotic places and our members would go along. So he called my wife, Marcia, and...
Who you met at RPCV Washington, correct?
Oh, yes. The guy who said, I'm here for community service, not social, found my wife on the through the steering committee. Persuaded her to organize a trip to Kenya for the RPCV. You know, it would be a group trip, so it would be congenial and it would have reduced airfare. So as the trip turned out, it was me, Marcia, Marcia's mother, my father, a friend of Marcia's from her college days who was a volunteer but lived off in Ohio, or, you know, didn't have any connection to RPCVW. And then...
Alice.
Huh?
Alice Alexander.
Yes, and then I think 2 or maybe 3 RPCVW members who wanted no part of any itinerary. They were looking for the cheap airfare. We saw them on the plane going over, we saw them on the plane coming back, and that was it. And that was the last travel adventure. But now NPCA is doing it, so it wasn't that it was a bad idea, it was just that Roger was ahead of his time.
Thank you very much. Gloria, I know you were involved and treasurer during the time that we got incorporated into a formal 501c3 nonprofit organization. So I would like you to speak a little bit about how that came about.
Okay, just a little bit. When I first got back in '83, my first Peace Corps event, I found out about RPCV Washington because I had come down to look for a job and I had gone to the Peace Corps office and stuff. And the first event I went to was something on Capitol Hill where Tom McGrew was moderating, and he talked about how Peace Corps had taken over aid, that half of all Peace Corps volunteers were former aid volunteers, how they had taken over Save the Children. He named everything else. And then I got up and said, Peace Corps has taken over aid, Save the Children, World Wildlife Fund, all of these. But one thing Peace Corps hasn't taken over is Peace Corps. And, you remember? And I started to talk about the political appointee that we had who was about the worst one, never been in Africa, never been anything, and said point blank that if a volunteer was killed in service, he would order a coffin. And that was his entire responsibility, and said that was his responsibility as director and as a human. He really didn't care if one human being to another, if people were killed.
Was that Dick Celeste?
What?
Was that Dick Celeste?
No. This was Willie Gonzalez, who was Peace Corps Ghana director. No, not up at that level. This was the guy who was actually in country, and this is before internet or email or anything like that. The only way that you could complain to headquarters was to ET, to terminate and go back. And so I got up there and said, but Peace Corps hasn't taken over Peace Corps, and there was this whole cheers, and that was one of the things that went into that. when I first came, it was a very different organization. I was one of the few recently returned people. It was mostly people who had been out for a while, and that was very helpful to me as somebody who was new to get connections getting established in Washington. And I may say one of the things that bothers me a lot about RPCV Washington now is that it's mostly people who are recently back. And that's great for them, and there's nothing wrong with people who were recently back, of course, but people like me who have been there a while can feel out of place. And also, I think the recently returned people could really benefit from having more established people who can help you find jobs, who can help you get oriented, things like that. It's very helpful for me. I was idealistic. I joined I was the National Council of Returned Peace Corps Volunteers and was elected to the board and wound up with all these bureaucrats wherever. And it was sort of a little bit of a joke because RPCV Washington was a very innovative organization working hard, and the National Council sat around and had meetings and meetings and meetings, and Holland McKenna said 2 years is a short amount of time for them to get something done. So there was a big rivalry. When I moved back I was in Chicago business school. When I moved back, I had a job in Washington, and I had my MBA in finance and statistics, and I said, I think I'd like to be treasurer, and I was moving back, and I became what I believe was the first person to run for an RPCV Washington office who was not a resident of the area and was planning to move back, and they said, we'll take you anyway, and I'd been paying my dues. So by this time, the organization was not quite the seat of the pants organization that it had been. It had been established with officers, and you had a past president, and it was a bit established. Every year we went to the Kennedy gravesite. We had a speakers bureau that had something every other month. There was a fairly regular newsletter. It was a fun place to be, but it was established. The meetings were, the first Wednesday night of every month, held at a place. So it was there. So in the days before Lotus, before Excel, before Lotus, for those of you who may not have heard of it, got down with my little calculator, the HP 12C calculator, and wrote up everything and redid it. That's the way it was. It was all, there. And then my contribution to RPCV Washington started the day I got home, and there was a letter from the Internal Revenue Service. Because my name was on the checking account since I was authorized to write checks, and I was the one who got the statements. And it was made out to Agua, which I had never heard of, AAAGW, saying, we don't have any records of your taxes paid or whatever. And in my normal, very calm self went crazy, calling up people, oh my God, what's this Agua? And it was apparently the Action Alumni Association of Greater Washington had been some name way back when, and we had never incorporated. We were not a 501c3. We had all they had was a checking account. So I go absolutely crazy, and we figure, oh my God, what's wrong? And we enlisted the help of June Gerteg, who was a RPCV from Uganda in the late 60s and was a partner at Freed, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson. Shriver as in Sergeant Shriver, who agreed to take us on a pro bono basis, and we applied for 501c3 status as a charity, and then we got some 501c4 status going back. And basically, we're sort of pleading nitwit status. The reason that we didn't apply for it before is because we didn't know anything beforehand, which is true. And they were she said, can you file the papers for us? And she said, you can't have a major law firm file papers and then plead nitwit status that you don't know what you're doing. So they filled it out, and then I signed it. They filled it out honestly, they just made it. If I may answer, we had to give the number of employees, the top 5 employees who earned over $60,000 a year. We had to provide their salaries and names. As is per IRS regulations, we said we're all volunteers. We were asked to list assets. We were asked to list the balance sheet. We showed our assets were a food cooler at $20, office supplies at $30, a felt banner at $10, and 2 food plates at $5. We had assets of $65 was there. And there were all kinds of others about the expenses, and there was, $300 to the Friends of Kenya for mailing, and, you know, all kinds of other cute little things that come down. Sale of mailing labels and cookbooks was $412.10, and we got it going. So we got it. We got our 501c3. We got our 401c3, and then we were an incorporated group. So with that, after 3 years, I handed it over to the next person, and while have not held office at RPCV Washington, have still come to events. And I would say one friend who I hosted the first RPCV Washington event I had ever gone to came to my wedding 25 years later. So there's a lot to be said for what RPCV Washington can give.